For moments that marked the historic handover from a British colony to a territory of China. 25 years ago, Britain's rule over Hong Kong came to a close as the colonial flag slipped down the mast and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region's Bohemia and China's red flag flew high. In the 156 years of British administration, millions fled mainland China for the freedoms of Hong Kong. Territory transformed from a collection of villages to a global financial centre. As the 1997 deadline loomed for the return of the city to Chinese rule, Beijing made a pledge to Hong Kongers that for 50 years their rights, their freedoms, and their way of life would be left untouched, and their ability to govern themselves would be preserved through the one country, two systems framework.
Hong Kong people, although they're a bit worried, still to believe that Beijing will live up the promise, that they will feel even a bit excited to see, oh, that's a new era for Hong Kong, what will happen. 25 years today already have been passed by. The time's gone so fast. All the promise of freedom being evaporated, even worse than most of the people would expect.
Zheng's own story is a reflection of that change. An employee of the British consulate, he was detained in the mainland during a work trip and, he says, tortured into making a recorded confession. He has since been granted asylum in the UK, where over 100,000 Hong Kongers have moved to escape Beijing's tightening grip under the national security law, sweeping legislation that targets subversion, succession, foreign collusion, and terrorism.
Separatism, subversion, secession, colluding with foreign powers, and terrorism are so ill-defined, which means that it's been a blanket ban for all freedoms of the people, as they set up a new system for handling the national security case in the judiciary. They politically appoint some judges to be handling this national security case. They also introduced the secret police apparatus, the national security apparatus. From China to Hong Kong, they also intend to impose much draconian law, such as fake news law, etc. The human rights situation in Hong Kong is going to be worse and worse and worse.
Since the law was imposed in 2020, over a dozen news outlets, including the Apple Daily newspaper, and 60 trade unions have disappeared. For over a year and a half, nearly every high-profile member of the opposition has been held in pre-trial detention under the law. This July 1st will be the first since the handover with no protests.
When you look at the pictures that are coming out of Hong Kong, all you're seeing is sort of security, these gigantic 2-meter tall water barriers that are being placed all around the sites of these official ceremonies, and also the sort of creep of the security services that political groups and parties that had protested for years. In fact, that's, been a part of the anniversary, the July the 1st sort of calendar for so many years, that protest march. But today we're hearing that these people have been called and warned by security services, called for tea, as they might be in the mainland, and told not to protest.
Hong Kong journalist and author Louisa Lim remembers the handover in 1997 and how Hong Kongers themselves were deliberately excluded from the ceremony and the negotiations around it. At the time, they were promised the chance to govern themselves. But now, she says, they're further from that than ever before, especially with the city's new leader, John Lee, a former police commissioner who oversaw the crackdown on the pro-democracy movement.
In 1997, the slogan, and I think it was a very attractive slogan, was, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. And what we see is such small circles of influence now. John Lee has been chosen by such a tiny circle of people, and the legislature itself is becoming less and less representative, probably because Beijing is so very aware. I mean, the last election before the electoral system was changed, in the district council elections in 2019, these were a massive landslide for the pan-democratic forces. Again, it's a very considered strategy to only allow certain types of Hong Kongers to be represented, and those are Hong Kongers who are loyal and patriotic, loyal to Beijing.
In 1997, Hong Kong independence was a fringe, almost unthinkable prospect for most. But as Hong Kong's promised autonomy and democratic development have receded, it has entered the mainstream. Activist in exile Anna Kwok was born in the year of the handover. And while her political senses weren't sharpened until the 2014 Umbrella Movement protests, She says she grew up with the awareness that she and her fellow citizens were different from their compatriots to the north.
In Hong Kong, you would see people marching on the streets, attending June 4th vigils, and, really voicing out their disagreement with the government very outwardly. From there onwards, I would have this fake sense that, would you say I'm a Chinese? I would think, no, I feel that sounds a bit weird, but I never, have that underlying political ideology to support or understand why I would not call myself a Chinese, but instead I would call myself a Hong Konger.
25 years since she and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region were born, Kwok says Hong Kongers are still fighting to redress the injustices of that rainy night in 1997, when they were handed from one sovereign to another without being asked what they wanted.
It is our right as a people to decide how we want to move forward and how we want to live our lives. We talk about fighting for democracy, fighting for freedom, and fighting for, having this right to decide for ourselves. But I think more fundamentally, we are really just hoping to be respected as people and as humans.
After a century and a half as a British colony and now 25 years on an ever-tightening leash under Beijing, the wait for Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong has been long. On this historic date, the barriers between the people and that promise appear higher than ever before. Ryan Kilpatrick for TaiwanPlus.